Hello! So by the end of this video, your character will be able to interact with objects in the world like this. We'll print some text. We'll also be able to skip it by holding down the button. And while we're interacting with the world like this, the game actually pauses like it did in many old survival horror games. So this builds off the previous tutorial about text printing on the screen. So I would do that tutorial first before you follow this one. Okay, just as a side note, this is going to end up being a two-part video because it ended up being pretty long. So I wanted to split it up into two parts. So I'll post the next part tomorrow. So here's the TextPrinter class again. I've added a few things and moved things around somewhat. So I want to just explain how it works now and what's different. We've got a serialized field for the normal text speed and skip text speed. This is so in the inspector, we'll be able to tweak the different text speed depending on if you're holding down the button or not. And then we've got this current text speed, which just does that. It holds the current text speed, so it'll flip between these two. Got our text mesh as before. In Awake, we're just getting our text mesh component. So previously, we actually just typed in a string to print here, and we just started printing the text as soon as we went into the start method. So we're going to make it a bit more sophisticated so we can actually use it for something useful in our game. So let's have a look at how it works. So this time, instead of using the start method to print our dialog, we're using a public method we've created called print. And it has two parameters you can see. Now, one is a list of strings called sentences. So this will actually allow us to have more than one line of text printed one after the other. And then we've also got this action on finished printing. Now, if you don't know much about actions and delegates and things like that, I have a video about that, which would probably help you. But to give you it in the most pure, simple form, a delegate is a type of object that can hold a reference to a method. So you can plug a method in as a parameter and then execute it later. Now, action is just a predefined kind of delegate, which holds a reference to a method that doesn't have a return type and can have a number of parameters if you so choose. Now, the amazing utility of using an action as a parameter here is that no matter where we call this print method from, we can plug in a method from the sending object that will get called back to once we're finished, whatever we're doing with the text printing. So it's a good way of sending messages back and forwards about when we should be starting and stopping things. We'll see this in action a little later on. Okay, so inside this print dialog, which has an I enumerator as the return type, which is because we're starting it as a coroutine, it needs that return type. You'll notice we're using a for each loop instead of a for loop here. So I usually tend to prefer for each loops if I can get away with them. They look a bit cleaner and they're a bit easier to read. Whether you use for loops or for each loops is a lot of the time down to personal preference, but I prefer for each loops when I can get away with them just because of the reasons I said before. It just looks a bit neater. You'll notice we have a for each loop inside another for each loop here. That might be a bit weird for someone who hasn't seen that before, but it's not that tricky to get your head around. So because it's so readable, it should make sense. So for each sentence, we do this, and then we get into this for loop in that sentence, and we go through every letter in that sentence. And then once that's done, we will go back to the next iteration on the next sentence. Okay, but let's go through line by line. The RepositionSentence method here, I will get into later. All that does is make sure that the text always prints from the right space on the screen and adjusts for the length of the text, but we'll get to that later. So what do? We say textmesh.text equals string.empty, so we clear the text first, then we wait for 0.1 seconds, and then what are we going to do? We say for each letter in the sentence, we're going to do the thing where we just add the letter to the text, same as before. This time I've had this little guard clause here. I say if the letter equals a blank space, continue. So that means we'll ignore this under here and we'll continue to the next iteration of this loop, so the next letter. And the reason for that is that we don't want to wait while printing a space because it looks weird. Now, this handle text speed, this is a method we call at the start of each iteration of the letter being printed. So what this does, if we have a look down here to this private method, we just say if input.getKey and there's keycode.e, you can set it up in your input settings or whatever if you want, but I'm just doing it like this to keep it simple. So if we get the E key, then the current text speed equals skip text speed. Otherwise, it will be the normal text speed. So every time a letter is being printed, we're checking if we're holding the button or not. If we are, then we set the speed to the faster speed. If not, we're setting it to the normal speed. Okay, so what happens after all the letters are printed? So then we jump down to this yield statement. Now, if you watched the episode about text printing, which I hope you did, then you'll know that we were using wait for seconds, okay? And the cool thing is you can actually wait until, so not a specific period in time, but until any condition is true. And so what I'm saying here is we're going to wait until input.getKeyDown keycode.e. So we're going to wait until the player presses the E key, and then we'll jump back up here to the next sentence, and then the whole procedure starts again. Okay. If you don't know what this is, when you do the open brackets and then the little arrow, this is called an anonymous method. You could actually plug in a method here. So bool is, for example, is key, is key down. Let me say is E key down. God, that's a horrible method name. And then just return input.getKey down keycode.e. Okay, we could do it like that too. And then instead of this anonymous method, we could just say wait until is E key down. But sometimes you don't want to make a method for this. Sometimes you just want to make a quick kind of anonymous method that you're just going to use this once. And that's what you use one of these Lambda expressions for. And that's how you do that. You do an open close bracket and then a little arrow like that, and then say input.getKey down and then keycode.e. There you go. There's your anonymous method. Now, what did we do after all of the sentences are printed? So then we set the text again to string.empty. So we clear the text that was there before because we don't need to show anything anymore. It's the end. And then here we say on finished printing ? .invoke. What the fuck does that mean? So if you remember what we said before, an action is just a variable that holds a reference to a method. Well, what we're doing here is we're saying if this method isn't null, that's what this little question mark does. So we're saying as long as this method is actually something, then we're going to invoke it, which means we're going to call it. You can actually just call it like this, just to give you an idea. It's just a method. It's just a method that you've defined somewhere else, and you're sending it as a variable. It's really cool. So then when we get to the interaction controller later, we can call back to the interaction controller once the printing's finished, and it will know what to do from there because it's back in control, if it makes sense. Okay. Okay, so just to understand it a little bit more visually, with our interaction controller, which we haven't set up yet, but from there we're going to call the print method on the text printer, and we're going to send as a parameter a method that we'll call back to later, like this. Okay, so now the text printer is printing, everything's doing its thing, and then once we finish, we call that on finish method from the text printer, which calls back to the interaction controller, and then afterwards it's all forgotten and everything's returned to the interaction controller. It's really good to do it like this because the text printer doesn't know anything about the thing that tells it to print. All it knows is it will get a method and it will have to invoke the method at the end of printing. And that's good because it keeps our code a little bit separated and not too tangled together. Okay, now let's finally hit that reposition sentence method that I was telling you about. Okay, so the first thing we do is we set the text to sentence, and we do that so that we can get the position of the first character and the last character in the sentence. So we need to know how big the sentence is going to appear on the screen. So we set the text to that sentence. Then we use this force mesh update so that it will actually update those positions correctly. So this first character, this is just, you can go into the text mesh and you can find information about the position of each character on each line, which is really useful for us. So what we do is we take the first and the last character, and then we get their positions, the top left position of the first character, and then the top right position of the last character. And then all we do is we set our position of the whole text mesh to be 0 minus the first character position.x plus the last character position.x divided by 2. So I'll show you visually so you get the calculation, because I think it's really not that tricky. So why do we need to reposition the text anyway? Well, if you set it to be formatted in the center, that's fine. You can just type and everything will come from the center like this. But it does look a bit weird in games. I don't know why, but something about all the characters moving, it seems a bit strange. So it's better for me to have it formatted to the left so we can type like this and then everything comes out in a nice tidy line like that. But then if we have a line here, let's just say this is the line. Okay, we need to find a way to now center this to the middle of the screen. So what we do is we just get the position of this character here and the position of the last character on the screen, and then you add the first number to the second number, so we end up with a number over here, and then we divide it by 2, which would end up here, and then we say 0 minus this number here, which is the halfway point between these two characters, which will end up being here. And then when we've got it formatted to the left, we set it to be this position, and as you can see, it ends up in the center. Okay, so that's the end of today's video. Tomorrow, I'm going to upload the video where I will talk about how to get the player to actually interact with the objects and pausing the game. But we've done the majority of the work now. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Sub if you want, like if you wanna, and I'll see you tomorrow.